everyone. My name is Amanda Opitz, and I'm the Communications Coordinator here at the YWCA. And today we have a special edition of our YW Talks lecture series.
Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. All here and accounted for. As you likely know, the 64th session of the Montana Legislature is now in session. I know. And right now, our local lawmakers are making really important decisions in Helena that are impacting Montana families and will continue to impact Montana families for years to come. So, the YWCA recently embarked upon an advocacy initiative that started out of YWCA USA, and we are now just kind of dipping our toe into advocacy work. And so we have assembled some of our partners in the good fight for women and families in Montana. And today we have with us Sarah Howell from Montana Women Vote, Jen Ewell from the Women's Foundation, Kim Spurzum from the National Coalition Building Institute, NCBI, Missoula, and Kat Warner from the YWCA. So each of these women are going to give a brief presentation about an issue that their organization is currently working on. That's also a focus area of the YWCA. And then we'll open it up for discussion and questions afterwards. So with that, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. I was asked to speak for a few minutes about Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion, I'll give a 2-minute background and then an update on what we're looking at right now during the session. When the Affordable Care Act was originally written and passed in 2010, it required all states to expand their Medicaid program to provide affordable health coverage for people making 138% of federal poverty limit, which is about $16,000 a year for an individual, about $32,000 for a family of 4 and lower. Well, then the Supreme Court said, never mind, it actually has to be a state choice. And so that is why we are in the position of having to opt into Medicaid expansion. About 26 states, maybe 26 and a half, there's one state sort of in the middle of the process, have expanded Medicaid so far. We are in year 3 of our efforts to get Montana to expand Medicaid. Here's what expanding Medicaid in Montana would do. It would provide quality, affordable health coverage for about 70,000 low-income Montanans. Many of those are working Montanans. They are people who have multiple jobs, who work full-time. They are farmers and ranchers. They are seniors, ages 50 to 64. They are veterans. They're low-income single moms. And these are folks who fall below that 138% federal poverty limit. Expanding Medicaid would also bring federal funds into Montana. Right now, we think it's about $1.9 million a day that we are leaving on the table. And that's our federal tax dollars that Montanans are paying that's currently going to New Jersey and California and North Dakota and other states that have expanded Medicaid. Those federal funds would not just provide access to care for low-income folks, but they would also create jobs. We estimate about 12,000 good-paying jobs would be created. They would give a boost to our state economy, and most importantly, they would really help the bottom line of rural hospitals and community health centers, many of which are really struggling under the burden of uncompensated care or charity care. So that's a sort of snapshot of Medicaid expansion. We are pretty excited that on Monday, this last Monday, the governor introduced his bill called the Healthy Montana Plan. It's House Bill 249. This is actually a really unique way to expand Medicaid. It's what's called a third-party administrator plan, which basically means that the state will partner with a private insurance company or multiple private insurance companies to run the program. This is the same way that we run Healthy Montana Kids, which is a very popular, successful program. But this also allows the state to keep control of a few important parts of the program, including financial savings and financial risk. It also allows the state to think about folks with specific types of care, acute mental health needs, for instance, or sort of long-term facility-based care, and to take that population of folks and put them onto our existing state-run Medicaid plan. So it allows the state to decide if there are folks with special acute needs that we can get them into the program that works best for their health needs. We think that Medicaid expansion is the right thing for Montana for a lot of reasons. We think that the majority of folks up in Helena agree with us right now. And we think that there's a small handful of legislators who would like nothing more than to kill this bill. So one of the things that we're doing is encouraging everyone to contact your legislator. There's a web forum online at mt.gov. You can also call the switchboard and leave a message in support of House Bill 249, the Healthy Montana Plan. We also have a series of lobby days when we'll be carpooling up to the Capitol to speak to folks in person, to make sure that people who are experiencing a lack of access to healthcare, who are in the coverage gap themselves, get a chance to tell their stories. And I do have a handout that has a couple of these numbers and specifics, so I'll just pass that around. I'll stop there.
Awesome. So I'm Jen Ewell, and I'm the director of the Women's Foundation of Montana. And we work on economic self-sufficiency for Montana women and a brighter future for girls across the state. We're best known for our grant making to nonprofits in the state. But another piece of our work is research and advocacy, and I've been asked to talk a little bit today about equal pay in the state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about equal pay, a little bit about the recent work that's been done on it, and then a little bit about a couple things that are happening this year in the legislature in that arena as well. So in 2012, the Women's Foundation of Montana did an extensive piece of research and published a report called the Status of Women in Montana Report. And in that, we sort of shined a light on the fact that Montana women have a significant gender gap in their pay in the state. So it's about 74 cents to a man's dollar overall for full-time paid work in Montana, as compared to the national average, which is also not great, of about 77, 78 cents on the dollar, depending upon what particular piece of research you're looking at. And at the time when we published that, we didn't feel like it was something that was going to get a lot of attention. Fortunately, we were asked to present to the governor at that time on the issue, and he decided to create an equal pay task force for the state of Montana. So we got a lot of attention across the state in the press, and the task force started that next May. Actually, we didn't begin work until the fall. But since then, we've been able to kind of keep the momentum going, keep some attention on the issue, and I think we're starting to be able to implement some programs and potentially policies as well that will start to change that. Some of the pieces of work that have already been accomplished are that we held an Equal Pay Summit about a year ago in Bozeman and brought together people from all across the state to talk about the issue. Some of the sort of pieces of it that we looked at are, the workplace. I think, when we talk about the gender pay gap, what we're talking about is not just discrimination. That's certainly a piece of it. We know that there is still gender discrimination that occurs, and some of our work is trying to document that and look at what that looks like in the state. But some of the bigger pieces of the gender pay gap also have to do with the fact that we just live in a country and in a state in which the workplace was really created with men in mind to begin with. So, for instance, our workplaces don't provide much support for women in their nurturing and caregiving roles, and so that looks like, not having paid family leave of any sort for a lot of people, not having maternity leave or paternity leave for that matter, not having leave to take care of sick loved ones, and so that sometimes means that women either can't take jobs that they would otherwise, or they lose jobs once they have them. That certainly affects their pay. We also know that in our state, a lot of the jobs that are the best paid are still jobs that are traditionally male jobs and are still primarily male jobs. So there's a larger pay gap in those states where, for instance, there's a big extractive industry that's a big portion of the economy. So like the jobs on the oil rigs in eastern Montana are going to be primarily held by men, not women, and it's certainly that way in a lot of the other industries as well, such as mining, logging. So that's a piece of why we have a larger gender pay gap here. That's a tougher one to figure out how to fix. It has a lot to do with us thinking about whether it works for women to move into sort of non-traditional jobs, and if so, how we have to change those workplaces to support women better in those jobs. So that's some of the other work that we're trying to look at. One of the things that we did early on, about a year ago, was to start doing wage negotiation workshops in the state. So we know that one of the other reasons that women are paid less is that from the very beginning, when they apply for a job, they're less likely to, well, first of all, they're less likely to apply for a job that they might be able to get because they don't have the confidence to do so. They're less likely to argue for what they're worth, to negotiate. So they're less likely to say, what does this job pay? And to say, actually, I'm worth more than that, and I think I should get paid this. And also less likely to ask what the benefits are. So the wage negotiation workshops are happening both in job services across the state, and also the Women's Foundation has granted money to AAUW to do similar trainings in universities and colleges across the state to start to change that dynamic, hopefully. More recently, the Equal Pay Task Force recommended to the governor also some policy change. And there are several pieces of those that are moving forward in the legislature. I actually didn't know until yesterday if that was happening. So I found out yesterday. Some of them are actually going to be happening. Our very own Senator Diane Sands has proposed a bill that gets at paycheck fairness. So on the national level, there has been a law that has been proposed several times, has not yet passed, about paycheck fairness. And we have one now in Montana that Senator Sands has proposed. And ours is a pretty simple bill. It's a lot smaller than the federal version. But basically what it says is that nobody can be fired or experience any kind of negative consequences for talking about how much they get paid. And they also you cannot ask someone to sign something that says that they won't talk about what they get paid. So that's the gist of the bill. And the reason this is important, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with Lily Ledbetter and her story, but she's a very famous fair pay advocate. She actually came to Montana to speak at our summit last spring. And in her experience, she worked for Goodyear Tire for many, many years and moved up in the ranks, became a manager of a division for them, and then found out one day, because of a secret note that somebody passed her, that the other people that were in the same positions in different divisions were men, and they were all making far more money than she was. And so she went and asked for more money, and they said no, and she quit and she sued them, and she lost, sadly. But in the wake of that, she has taken it upon herself to really travel and educate. And just a few years ago, there was another law passed in her honor, the Lily Ledbetter Act, that basically at least allows people to have more protections as they basically get more time on the clock to look at the discrimination that they experienced and to get compensation for that, if that happened to them. But the Fair Paycheck Act is basically meant to try and reduce, the experience of things like that, to allow people to at least talk about what they get paid. In addition, so that one is going to be Senate Bill 158. In addition, Senator Mary Farrow has introduced another one, Senate Bill 198, and this one is more of an internal audit issue. So one of the other recommendations of the Equal Pay Task Force was that the state of Montana should look at the way in which they pay folks and make sure that they're paying people equally, at least within their own ranks. So we did that. We did an audit of the internal state government and pay. And what we found out is that actually the state of Montana, which we thought might be true, is doing better than a lot of other workplaces. So they're paying more fairly. Still, women make a little bit less even in the same job, about 98%. However, if you look at overall pay, they make significantly less still, about 86% of men. And that is partially because women are less likely to hold the high-paying jobs, so they're less likely to be in leadership. They're also less likely to be in those non-traditional jobs that I spoke about. And those are the main things. The other piece of information is that, and this is part of the negotiation piece, women are less likely to be paid what they're worth, and that a lot of women are overeducated for the jobs that they hold. So that's true as well. But this bill that Mary Cafaro has proposed is basically asking the state to think about longevity pay for all of its employees, but this will affect women predominantly, meaning that if they go home to take care of a newborn baby or a family member, when they come back, they should still be at the same place in their longevity pay. They shouldn't lose those years in their retirement benefits and that kind of thing. So that will be another one that will be upcoming. I did write up a little piece on this. I'll pass it out to you. On the back, it talks about the bills that I've just been discussing. There is supposed to be one more that I haven't seen the draft yet, that basically looks at unemployment insurance for victims of domestic violence. So that one might be of special interest to all of you. And that one is asking that we consider increasing the time in which folks can get their unemployment insurance. So currently, our laws say that victims of domestic violence only need to get 10 weeks of unemployment insurance when they have to leave a job because of domestic violence, and we'd like to see that increase to 28 weeks, which is kind of the norm and what other folks get for their unemployment. I'll pass this out. The Senate Bill 158, which is Diane's bill, which is looking at fair paycheck, is going to have a hearing next Friday morning at 8 a.m. And of course, if any of you can come, we would love that. Also, if you are interested in contacting your legislators, that's awesome. Tom Facey is on the committee that is going to be considering that. Of course, I think Tom is probably going to be in support of it, but I think it's always helpful if they've heard from their constituents and they can quote that as they're having these discussions and sort of justifying their support. And also, if you have stories of discrimination that you've experienced and you want to send that to me, that's really helpful. I'm on the Equal Pay Task Force for the state, and we're going to be sort of collecting these stories and organizing some of the support for some of these bills. So I'd love to hear from you on that. Thanks.
And I'm Kim Spurza from NCBI, so I'm going to give you a little history of who NCBI is, what we do, a little about myself and why this issue is so important to me, and then give you a little rundown of the state of bullying in Montana. So NCBI, we're a leadership development organization that really empowers individuals to share their stories, to create allies across group lines, and so we just empower people to kind of go out, hear from each other, and then start listening, and then develop the skills to end all oppression. So it's a really simple, easy job. It's really amazing. We get everything done every single day, and it's really easy, so you should probably work there. Anyway, so I'm Kim Spurzum, like I said. I have been working on this issue since I think I was in high school, so in the late 90s. The reason this issue is so important to me, I think it was in 98 or 99. In my high school, I'm from Helena originally. And there was a lot of LGBT violence in my high school. The word fag was written on my locker. My friends had their car windows broken out. People were being pushed down staircases, but just bumped down the stairs. And it increased and increased. And we went to our school and we sat down with our principal, and she said there was nothing legally she could do, and she was fearful to act because she was fearful for her own job if she moved forward to protect students. And so I'm kind of an aggressive, sassy person, and I didn't really take that very kindly. And so we went down and met with the Montana Human Rights Network and the ACLU of Montana and started creating a task force, which now is housed under NCBI, which is the Montana Safe Schools Coalition. And that's really when I got my policy spark and really being passionate about this issue. But things didn't really change very rapidly, even though that we were having that conversation. My friend wrote a story, an expose in our paper, about what it's like to be an LGBT youth in our school, and the teacher who published the article was actually fired because they were a non-tenured teacher, and our principal bullied them, and luckily the paper editor refused to come forward. But after they were fired, we came forward and met with our principal, and it forced a lot of students to be outed by our principal in order to lobby for the educator, who wasn't even an LGBT advocate. He actually was a religious man, but he really believed in the right of all students to share their opinions, and he was then faced the consequence of being an ally in that role. So this issue is really important to me. I've been working on it, I realized, for 16 years, which is like the age of a high school student now. And so it's quite ironic now that we're once again up at the legislature. So bullying impacts everyone in the state of Montana. All young people are impacted. Oftentimes we come into following these rules that there's like the bully and the victim, but that's not necessarily the case, because oftentimes people who are victimizing other people are hurting themselves, and the CDC even reports students who are bullied, are receiving, they're missing school, they're getting lower GPAs, but also the students that we see that are victimizing other students are experiencing increased use of drug and alcohol. They're taking increasing risks with risky sex behaviors. They're engaging in vandalism, fights, and they're also at-risk youth. And then you're like, oh, well, what about all of the bystanders and the people standing around? Well, the CDC also reports everyone who's just standing around watching the fight is also now being impacted by violence in their schools. So we're seeing them miss school, increasing uses of tobacco, alcohol, other drugs, which we know Montana is the highest with youth of all of those. And also increased mental health challenges are being faced by students just witnessing. So you're like, wow, this is really sad. Why isn't Montana doing anything? Well, Montana, as you may or may not know, is the only state in the entire nation of all 50 states that doesn't have any law on the books that statewide mandates that there should be protection in schools. The only thing it states in the Montana Code Annotated that schools should adopt a policy to protect all students. And should is really something like you should make your bed maybe, or you should wash your dishes, or you should, I don't know, get up early before you have to do things, or should be prepared. I'm not sure. I don't think should be really a word used when we're talking about the protection and the safety of children. So what does it look like in Montana, right? So I'm telling you just really vague things. So I have some Montana stats, because I love stats, and if you don't, you could just kind of zone out for a minute. So 26% of Montana students face bullying. You're like, oh, that doesn't seem high. That's actually significantly statistically higher than the national average. Also, 32% of those students are Native American students in urban schools like Missoula. An urban school is a school not on a reservation. And 38% of students with disabilities are experiencing bullying or mistreatment in our schools. 9% of all of our high school students said that they missed at least one day in the past 30 days due to experiencing violence. I couldn't imagine. I mean, 10% of your student body is missing a day of school because they don't feel safe. It's ridiculous. So everyone gets bullied, right? You all got bullied, we got bullied. Like, what the heck? Why don't these kids just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, right? We can get over it. They did. They're just kids being kids is what we hear a lot. Well, that's not the fact. Like, 8% of Montana high school students and 12% of our middle school students tried to commit suicide last year. That's really high. 21% of all Native American students in urban schools and 15% on the reservation tried to commit suicide. And 22% of our students with disabilities tried to commit suicide last year. So that's like over 1 in 5 students with a disability in our schools tried to commit suicide. And this is a record. 49.7% of those students reported that bullying had an influence on them wanting to commit suicide. You might say, those numbers seem high, but suicide is the second leading cause of death in Montana right now. And Montana's in the top 3, been in the top 3 states of suicide being the leading cause of death of our young people over the past 10 years. In fact, from 1981 to 2010, youth suicide, so that's youth age 5 to 14, so we're talking young children, has increased 60%. So actually, suicide is becoming one of the leading causes of death even for young people ages 5 to 10 in the state of Montana. And that to me is really unacceptable. So if you're not drawn by the stories of bullying, I think like suicide is one thing that can be prevented. It's a social health condition that we definitely as adults can be impacting, and we can be empowering young people to take a stand.
Excuse me, didn't you first say 5 to 14 and then you said 5 to 10?
Well, they break it up, so these are just general overviews of statistics, and I can give you the link. The state actually just formed a suicide Prevention Coalition, I think. We finally got on the board with that, and it's a really amazing report. I think it's about 68 plus pages long. It's really beautiful and full of charts. I love it. So also LGBT youth, which I haven't talked about before this point, and I was intentionally leaving them out because last year was the first year Montana actually gathered stats on them in the Youth Behavior Risk Survey, or the YRBS as it's known to many of us. And last year was the first year they ever gathered any stats. And those stats were 13.2% of Montana high school students reported being teased, name-called, or bullied because someone thought they were gay, lesbian, or bisexual, not because they did identify, because they didn't actually have students identify to cross-tabulate any real stats that we could use and give you today. And then, so hopefully that will change on our YRBS, but we know that that's one of the greatest ways that youth are victimized for any way that they appear different. They're targeted as being identifying in the LGBT community right now. And that's a really big concern for us, especially since our Montana High School Association refused to pass a transgender inclusive sports policy this Monday, or even talk about it, I guess I should say. So we've made the commitment to our young people to really start doing an action. In 2005, Superintendent Denise Juneau adopted the Graduation Matters initiative, which started here in Missoula. Luckily, we were the pilot baby program of that through Dr. Apostle. And that commitment, Graduation Matters, some of you might know, it's to graduate, right? But the real key is like the wording that's used with that. We're going to graduate 100% of our students regardless of circumstance and ability. And so I think that bullying and putting students at risk is covered under the Graduation Matters initiative. And if we're not addressing bullying and violence and safety at school, these students aren't going to be able to achieve, and they're being impacted, and we really need to take a chance to take a stand. In Missoula, luckily, we have a really great school board, we have great administrators, and they're doing really proactive work right now. So I'll just give you a brief update on that and then start wrapping up. So in Missoula right now, Dr. Apostle has founded a youth kind of a board similar to the school board that's happening right now, and this teen board's doing some really progressive work. So they're talking about creating a panel for restorative justice, where young people will actually help pass down the discipline, especially when it is involving bullying at school. So students will start being accountable to each other, and students will have more information. And a lot of people think, well, that'll create more gossip and this and that, but statistically it's showing across the board that when young people are passing down the punishments and being more aware of what is actually happening to other students, it decreases the amount of violence that's happening to every student in the school across the board. And so it's really quite powerful. Also, they're looking at passing transgender inclusive policies for restrooms and or sports teams right now in Missoula, not only protecting students, but our educators and our school staff, because though we have a non-discrimination ordinance in our town, that's not actually doesn't guarantee safety of our educators, because they're actually state/federal employees, because they're not paid by, though we are paid by tax dollars locally, they can still be fired. And so this is really great stuff that's happening, because what we're seeing right now is the reason that I really have a problem with some bullying bills that may or may not be proposed this legislative session is that they're really trying to criminalize the act of bullying, which in the one hand, makes sense to me. It's a crime. They're victimizing someone, it should be. But what we're seeing is that then school resource officers, or SORs as they're known to young people, are then ticketing, like physically writing tickets to teenagers in schools for pushing each other and hurting each other. And what that ends up doing is it ends up paving their way on a path of what we call the school to prison pipeline. Mm-hmm. So these students are getting tickets for dress code violations, for skipping school, for pushing another student. And by the time they graduate or drop out, they already have so many cumulative tickets. So if they get pulled over for a bad taillight or pulled over for disruptive conduct out in town, they're going to jail. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing young people exponentially, especially young people, disenfranchised youth, LGBT youth, youth of color, youth with disabilities, on this path. Like, it's paved by the time they graduate or are kicked out of school or drop out. And so we just pass a policy and it fixes everything, right? So that's what I'm here to tell you. Well, sadly, no. So once again, I'm going to go back to stats because I love numbers. So there's this great survey called the Montana Youth Voices. Well, it's Youth Voices. They do it in lots of states. But Montana utilizes, it's from the Qualia Foundation. It's really amazing. So I took a brief look at it, and only about 53% of middle school students, 46% of high school students feel valued at school. Then you look across the board, 50% of middle school students feel that they respect each other, 36% of high school students. 39% of middle school students view themselves as a leader in their school, and only 35% of high school students. So if we go and just try to implement a policy and say, okay, now there's a policy and you can't bully each other, these students aren't going to feel empowered to stop this. They're not going to feel that their voice is being heard. They don't feel respected at their school by staff or students. And so a policy change is not big enough. A policy would just be a Band-Aid on the situation, and it wouldn't change anything. So what the young people that I represent, as I'm here representing today, what they would like to see is, first of all, that this policy be enumerated. The only bill proposed so far by the wonderful local elected Kimberly Dudick from here in Missoula is not enumerated. And enumerated language means that you list out each protected category, and you might think, well, it's a policy and it says to protect everyone. Enumerated language is key to the young people that I speak on behalf of, and for our organization, we are part of a lot of national organization, a Safe Schools network, and we see enumeration as the key to this policy, because when you enumerate which groups are protected, it not only tells that school which students they need to protect, but it also empowers students to come forward and speak out. Because if you just have a bullying policy, and maybe you're in a very rural town, not to target rural towns, but this is just a story I hear often, or even here in Missoula, if it was not enumerated and you were maybe an LGBT student, you felt like you were the only student, you didn't feel, or if you were even a student of color and you didn't see other people like you at your school represented in the school staff or the school population, you might not feel comfortable just coming forward. But when that language is enumerated, it states that your school protects you, and that no matter, even if that's the administrator that you're coming forward to tell your story agrees or disagrees with you, you still are going to be heard and valued, and there's going to be repercussions for what's going on. And so beyond that, we just really want to train all school staff to start looking out for what's going on, and we think training is a key component, not only because that's what our organization does, but it's really important to train educators because the world has changed greatly and vastly in education, and then just making all these policies acceptable. So telling students that we change our policies. So often we create laws, but we don't tell the people most impacted by those laws that they have now been protected. That's all I have.
Well, my name is Kat Werner. I'm with the YWCA. I'm the Domestic and Sexual Violence Program Manager here. I've been with the Y for about 5 years, and so for the past 2 years, I've been working on the issue of human trafficking with a focus on sex trafficking specifically across the state and in our community. A couple of years ago when the Y really first learned about this issue and it being a problem in our state, we were one of the founding agencies to start an anti-human trafficking task force in Missoula, and I'm heading that task force, and so we're bringing law enforcement and other service providers to the table, and so that's been going on, which is really great, in addition to a state task force that is happening. So over the past couple of years, I've been not only providing services to both foreign nationals and U.S. citizens that have been victims of trafficking, but really also looking at different ages, so both adults and minors that were impacted by this crime. And as a task force, we really decided we'd be looking at outreach and education about this issue, because Montana is just really lacking in understanding of this being a problem, period, but then also this is something that doesn't just impact urban areas in our country, but really does happen here in Montana. So I want to just talk a little bit about the issue at hand. I'm going to just fall in line with some statistics, just like the other speakers, and look at the scope of the issue, and then talk about who is involved, right? So who are the people that are being victimized, but also who are, kind of the other parties, and then talk a little bit about House Bill 89 that is coming up here in this legislative session. So, really when I think of the issue of trafficking, what it really is it's modern day slavery. And when we look back at, the 1600s to the 1900s, the transatlantic slave trade, where approximately 9 million people were exploited for financial gains, we're looking at over 3 times that number currently. So really right now, more people are living enslaved across the world than during any other point in human history. And they're being controlled by either the force or the threat of violence, or of course the use of violence directly. So really what it is when I think of human trafficking, both sex and labor trafficking, it truly is the largest social justice and human rights issue over time, and something we need to address. It's an issue where it's really hard to get numbers because it's a crime, right? So it's illegal. So it's really hard to accurately say, so and so many people are impacted across the state or across the world. What we do know, though, is that estimates range anywhere from 27 to 30 million people across the world who are currently exploited either in a commercial sex or forced labor situation. And I think it's an important issue when I think of gender-based violence because it's very much a gendered process, because 80% of victims of human trafficking are women. And so, it is a crime that is certainly illegal anywhere across the world, right? We have through the Palermo Protocol, we have a law really that kind of governs certain statutes and rules all over the world, but it is thriving everywhere. So, looking at the business of human trafficking, it's really lucrative. It's a high profit, low risk crime. And when I do trainings, what I really talk about with people is, think about you have an ounce of Coke and you sell that and people use it, right? So you use the ounce of Coke, it's going to be gone. The person has to come and buy more. But if you have a person, if we're looking at a pimp who usually has around 3 women working for him, a woman making around $100,000 a year, it's a really lucrative business because, then the trafficker makes around $300,000 a year by exploiting women and forcing them into sexual services. So it's highly lucrative. It is the second fastest criminal industry in the world, fastest growing criminal industry in the world, with an annual profit of around $32 billion. So lots of money to be had. And then, really looking at who is involved, right? Who's involved in this industry? So who are the people that are being exploited? And, trafficking is really about vulnerability. And so what we find is that traffickers do really target the most oppressed and marginalized and most vulnerable people in our society. There's lots of research out there that shows, and that's again why it is such a gendered process and such a gendered issue. It shows that the vast majority, actually over 90% of girls and women working in the sex industry are victims of prior trauma. So they've either experienced domestic violence, child sexual abuse, sexual assault, before having been recruited into sexual services. We also know that age is an extremely high risk factor to become involved in sex trafficking. So we see children that have been involved in the child welfare system and the foster care system at higher risk. I think it's important to point out here that our foster care system doesn't create these kids. So it's, those systems are not at fault, but we do know that kids just have more vulnerabilities and are at higher risk when they have been through these situations. We do also know that the average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is 12 to 14. So that's really, that's incredibly young. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that in the United States, almost 2.8 million children run away each year. And out of those 3 million children, about 1 million of these kids are going to end up being lured into prostitution, pornography, some form of sexual services within 24 to 48 hours of hitting the streets. So, 1 million kids that end up in like Portland or Seattle that get off the bus and don't have anywhere to go and don't have food or don't have money, they're going to be like a prime prey for somebody who's looking for exactly those vulnerabilities. When I first got involved with this issue, I ended up working with a young girl who was a minor back then, who had a very typical story of having experienced, domestic violence in her home and homelessness and, a history of school truancy, who, was coerced into leaving the state of Montana and ended up in a really fragile situation where she was forced into a sexual service position, where within a 6-month period she was forced to have sex with over 500 customers while she was held captive by the trafficker. other marginalized populations, I think it's really important to remember our largest minority population in the state of Montana, and that's Native American women and children that have definitely been identified as one of the most economically, socially, politically disenfranchised group in our country. So, really thinking of risk factors that are especially present on reservations and in tribal communities. When we're thinking of extreme poverty, homelessness, lack of access to education, chronic unemployment, discrimination, and I really think simple lack of access to opportunities, right? Because I think we're really good in this country thinking that we create equal opportunity for everybody, and they are available for everybody to just use and get out there, but I think we also know that that's just not true. So really thinking about when I think of this issue, addressing the deeper issues of racism and systemic oppression and all of those things in our community. I want to mention the Bakken region, so the Bakken region up in the northeastern part of the state, because we are seeing increased numbers of young Native girls, but then also just of young women and girls in general that are being transported up into the Bakken, or that are finding their way, maybe initially voluntarily up there, because of course there's a lot of money to be had right now. But a lot of girls finding themselves offering commercial sexual services. There is a statistic that I recently saw where misdemeanor prostitution charges have skyrocketed in the Bakken. This was a statistic coming out of North Dakota, but it's prostitution is a misdemeanor charge, so we see that these girls and these women are the ones that are being charged. So their situation is being criminalized. I briefly want to address the demand too. I think it's really important to really think of, this is pretty basic economics. So as long as we have a demand, as long as we have Johns, as they're called, mainly males, really willing to pay for sex with, underage girls and adult women, we're gonna see this issue in our communities. There's a quote from a John, from a researcher who really focuses on prostitution and sex trafficking, and John said, "If I don't see a chain on her leg, I assume she made the choice to be there." And so I think it just really speaks to a paradigm shift that needs to happen in our society. We've seen it in the domestic violence movement, right, where we became aware that it's not just about asking the question, well, why doesn't she just leave? It's so easy, that's all she has to do. So we really need to look at changing, making that shift and understanding that these women and these girls they don't make the choice of, being in a prostitution situation. It's not voluntary, they're not there because the conditions of choice simply didn't exist. And then lastly, talking about the legislative session, which I think we have some pretty exciting stuff going on. The YWCA definitely believes that it's crucial to address this issue and look at, creating stronger policies to ensure victim safety and increased access to services for survivors, and along with that, making sure that offenders are being held accountable. So, the Attorney General's office, Tim Fox, is really making this issue his priority during his term, and so he and Representative Kim Dudek are bringing forward House Bill 89, and it is looking at demanding stricter penalties for traffickers exploiting girls and women. And so really the three main focus areas of this bill is to strengthen consistency with other states that already are prosecuting human trafficking cases successfully, so really making sure that our law from last session really follows the model laws of other states. Adding additional elements to the uniform law. They're looking at asset forfeiture, immunity for victims, ensuring benefits can be obtained, and social services support. And then I think the most exciting thing is the creation of a human trafficking education fund. So really the idea that we're going to have money set aside that's going to allow us to educate the public on this issue. We do know that the key to identifying and eventually serving victims is public identification of them. Like if we don't know what to look for and how to identify it, we're not going to be able to support them. So that's really exciting. There is a hearing coming up Monday on February 2nd. It'd be great. Obviously, hoping to either be present and maybe, share some experience. But I think what you can do, of course, is, call representatives and just let them know that you are in support of House Bill 89 and that you feel like this is an issue that we need to address in our community. And then What's not part of this bill is addressing the demand stronger, but I think that's something that might come, in 2015? So 2017, once some of these laws are in place, and this bill, hopefully, has shown that it's been more successful to address this problem. So, yeah.
To digest. And I appreciate our panelists, because these are big issues that we have scrunched into a very small window of time, but I would like to open it up for questions now, and we have 10, 12 minutes to kind of dig into these a little more. Do we all need to take a deep breath first? Let our brains settle on something. Well, maybe just in red, to kind of bring it home a little bit, we can walk through the panel and just briefly mention how folks here that care about these issues, that was kind of interspersed throughout, but how they can help, get involved in these issues and share their stories, and we'll start there.
Sure. So I think there's a number of ways for folks to get involved with Medicaid expansion. You can visit our website at montanawomenvote.org or our campaign website, the healthymontanacampaign.org. And there are ways you can sign up for more information. We do a weekly email during the legislative session that has updates on what bills are being assigned for hearings and, bill numbers and how you can contact your legislators. So that's one way to get sort of weekly information about the session. And we do have, in 2 weeks, our 9th annual Women's Policy Leadership Institute, which is a 2-day sort of hands-on conference up in Helena. We do a morning of citizen lobbying, so we storm the Capitol and track down legislators and tell them what we think, and then a day and a half of networking and relationship building and workshops on issues and skills, including Medicaid expansion, but also a broad array of other topics. So you can find out more information about that on our website, and that's a really fun time, and there'll be a lot of talk about Medicaid expansion. Oh, and I should mention, if you have a personal story or know somebody with a personal story of being in the coverage gap, someone who might qualify for Medicaid under expansion, we would love to hear those stories and talk to folks. I think that personal stories are really compelling, and legislators need to hear them.
So on the back of the sheet that I handed out, there are a few ways that you can get involved in the issue of equal pay if you are interested. As I mentioned, of course, email me if you want to get more involved. You can visit my website as well, sign up for the newsletter, and learn more in that way. There will be a lobby day on March 11th at the Capitol, and we'd love it if there were lots of you there to sort of rally around equal pay in Montana. In addition, there will be a second Equal Pay Summit that's happening in Butte on April 10th and 11th. And we don't have the agenda yet to share with you, but I think it's going to be awesome, of course, because I'm going to help organize it. And I think this year we're going to be talking a lot about STEM and science, technology, engineering, and math. That's one of the things that we fund for girls, trying to encourage girls to think about those kind of occupations that are high paying, and we'll have lots of jobs in the future. And there will be also some focus on entrepreneurship in general, but we'll also be looking at some of the policy change stuff we can be doing in the future to support equal pay. But what I always tell people as well is that equal pay is not so much about policies as about cultural change. And we know that there are more and more women moving into the workforce. We make up almost 50% of the workforce now. 40% of homes are supported either by a sole breadwinner that's a woman or a primary breadwinner that's a woman at this point in history. And so this is something that has to change. We cannot have our primary breadwinners making less than what they're worth and in order to support families. But I think it really also just starts at home. And I always tell people, the more within your house there is equality, the more there is going to be equality in the workforce as well. And so that's part of the conversation too. I'd encourage you to just think about that in your own lives.
I think first, if you have a young person in your life, listening to them, hearing what's going on, asking them truly what's going on, and just hearing them out of what school is like for them and hearing their experiences, because technology has changed our schools greatly. You can no longer escape being bullied, or go, you can no longer go home. It's 24 hours. And then beyond that, I think on February 19th, we're trying to hitch a ride with Montana Women Vote and try and talk. And I think Forward Montana, and there's an LGBTQ lobbying day coming, and so we're going to try and do some schools talk during that. And so I think that's when, because most of the schools bills that were promised, there's still no drafts up on any of them, so we're still really unclear as to where we are, but that won't stop our young people from rallying and being vocal, because they're pretty antsy, so I think that's what we got.
So the hearing for House Bill 89 is going to be on Monday, February 2nd, bright and early at 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, I think being there, either that and just being present and showing just in numbers that this is an issue that we feel impacts our communities, especially vulnerable populations that we work with. So that's an issue. That's one thing that you could do, reaching out to senators and representatives in support of this bill, and really letting them know that every single aspect of this bill. I think especially the Human Trafficking Education Fund is something that's hugely important, because we really need some funding to provide outreach, not just to community members, but to law enforcement and social service personnel. And in terms of outreach and education, I love doing presentations or trainings around this. So if you work for an agency, or if you, feel like you want to learn more about this and want to bring this to, a class, or an agency that you're working with, Missoula AIDS Council just reached out and said like, hey, is this something that you could come in and talk about? And I always would love to do that, because again, I think, it's a community issue. It's not a law enforcement issue. It's not a social services issue. It's really something that we all have to work together to make sure we can start providing services to survivors. And then I always just throw out, if you see something, the more you educate yourself about it, once you start seeing something, say something, know the National Human Trafficking Research Center hotline number, call the YWCA, call law enforcement, and just kind of speak out when you see something in your community. And then I always throw out there too, like, be a conscientious consumer, right? Because this is definitely an issue that is impacting us all over the US and all over the world. I recently found out a couple months ago that the shrimps that they sell at Costco are actually, the workers who farm these shrimps are working under unsafe working conditions, so it's definitely a labor trafficking situation. And so I was like, all right, I'm not buying these shrimps anymore, right? So it's like as simple as that in some ways. Sorry, but don't buy the shrimps. Yeah. So I mean, some of those little pieces I think are as simple as that, right? Where we as consumers can have a big influence also.
The bill you talked about was 89?
Yeah, House Bill 89.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? So, go ahead. Did you have a question?
I'm not sure that you didn't say Medicare and Medicaid at different times.
Well, it's just Medicaid. If I said Medicare, that was a mistake.
Okay, because the one could impact on the other. In other words, some other programs are saying Medicare for everybody.
No, this is just Medicaid expansion. I mean, one thing to know is that there are, of the 70,000 Montanans who would be eligible for Medicaid, there's a pretty healthy amount who are between the ages of 50 and 64, so not old enough to be eligible for Medicare, but in a particularly vulnerable time of life to be uninsured. So it is an issue for for Montanans of all ages, but this is all under the Medicaid program.
I have a question for Sarah. I was just wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth about expanding the time zone for domestic violence victims and their leave from work.
Oh, sure.
Why
That was
it's
actually
important.
something that Jen talked about. But
Do you know about it?
yeah, so
Go for it.
Everybody.
So current unemployment insurance is you are eligible for up to 28 weeks if you lose your job for a variety of covered reasons. If you leave a job because of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, you are only eligible for up to 10 weeks of unemployment. And if you can imagine leaving your job in crisis, maybe having to move, dealing with legal and law enforcement, 10 weeks is no time at all. So what this bill would do is actually bring that category of folks into the full 28 weeks eligibility for unemployment insurance, just like folks who lose their jobs because of layoffs or companies closing or whatever else.
Yes. It's a basic fairness thing too. I feel like why less for domestic violence? It's kind of weird. I was going to say too, I just got a text from Diane Sands this morning who says there's going to be a rally here next Thursday. Do you know about that, Cindy? Yeah. Okay. Well, there may be a rally in Missoula next Thursday. I'll let you know.
Any other questions?
I feel like in Missoula we have kind of it's a unique challenge with these kind of progressive issues where a lot of times our representatives were kind of preaching to the choir. And are there any legislators that you would recommend specifically that we reach out to on issues that maybe are not as sympathetic to these causes as a lot of our representatives are?
What do you think?
So here's what I would say about that. First and foremost, I think that being a legislator is a hard job. So even if your legislator is in favor of the issues, it's worth giving them a call or sending them an email to say thanks for the hard work, thanks for standing up for these issues, because these folks hear all sorts of really gross stuff, and to stand up for some of these issues is actually quite hard. So don't forget your legislator, your personal representative, even if they are on the right side of justice. But getting directly into, not to say that others aren't. Well, maybe others aren't. But
In Sarah's opinion, they are on the right side.
I am the arbiter of justice. Obviously. I will say that one of our legislators from Missoula, Doc Moore, is undecided on Medicaid expansion, and we know that because that is how he answered our Montana Women Vote voter guide. So, he's still making up his mind, and I think you should probably hear from constituents to help him make up his mind on Medicaid expansion. You guys should answer for your own issues, because I don't know, but...
I haven't gotten a chance, honestly, to look at the committee and to kind of analyze who's who, so I can't tell you. Sorry.
Yeah, I also can't. Oftentimes the bill gets pushed back, kicked, and never even sees the light of day, so everybody.
Well, I think with this human trafficking bill, what's nice is that there is bipartisan support, because it is promoted by Tim Fox, so I still do think that, you are right, absolutely. We live in kind of like maybe a more liberal bubble here in Missoula, right? But so I think if you get educated and then have access or can reach out to, family members or friends across the state, especially in more rural areas where I think all of these issues might be, maybe looked at through a little bit more of a conservative lens. And I think for trafficking, that lens of like, well, we don't need that because it doesn't happen here, period, right? Where, then if you are educated and you can actually say, you know what, it actually does happen. I went to this event at the Y and this lady spoke and she worked with, or whatever. And then maybe you could say, and one thing you could do is call your representative, So I think just really helping spread the word is something that you could do as well.
I think that's true. I think people are really influenced by their friends and family members. And so even if we might feel like our legislators are with us, if we can influence our friends and family who live across the state in other districts, and they might contact their legislators. It's good.
Great. Thank you all for coming. If you do have additional questions, we'll let you answer those in a second, but I do want to wrap it up just in case there are people that need to leave. So first of all, let's give another round of applause for our panel. thank you all for being here. We do have these lectures monthly, so we would invite you to come back. There is a sign-up sheet on the back table. If you are not on our mailing list and would like to get our newsletter and be informed about when we have upcoming YW Talks. The goal of our YW Talks is to provide the Missoula community with a space to discover and exchange information about topics that pertain to women and those of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. And next month, I want to announce that we will be having Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America here on Friday, February 20th at noon, and we have a couple of the ladies in the room today. And they're going to be discussing the connection between domestic violence and gun violence and what their organization is doing to try to combat some of those issues. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thanks. That was fun.
Yeah.